We all see the end of the battle in our minds, shaped by 1,000 movies. The crackle of the bonfire on a foreign shore, the glint of stolen gold in the firelight, piled high in open chests. We see the drinking horns raised, the boisterous laughter of victors, their faces smeared with the soot and blood of a conquered hall. We imagine the stories that will be told, the sagas that will be sung of their glory, their strength, their triumph. But this is a carefully edited picture, a lie of omission. Because that's not the end of the story, it's the beginning of a different one, a quieter one that unfolds in the shadows after the fires die down and the cheering stops. This is the story of the women. The queens, the princesses, the daughters of chieftains whose homes have just been turned to ash. Their fate was never a footnote. It was a strategy, a calculated, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient component of the Viking way of war. This is not a story of romance or of being rescued by a noble captor who recognizes a kindred spirit. That is a fantasy we tell ourselves to soften the edges of history. The truth is far colder, far more pragmatic. This is about what happened when the real price of defeat was paid, not in silver, but in flesh and blood, in shattered lineages and stolen futures. We will look at 7 of these fates, pieced together from the scant, brutal entries in monastic chronicles, the echoes in epic sagas, and the cold, hard data of modern science. Let's begin with a number, a statistic in a ledger of violence written by a monk on the Irish coast. The entry in the annals of Ulster is stark, stripped of all emotion, written with the cold efficiency of an accountant tallying a loss. For the year 821, it reads simply, "Atar was plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity." Just that. No names, no details, just a transaction. But contained in that single Spartan sentence is a world of absolute horror. Et, the place we know today as Howth, was not just a random village. It was a sentinel of rock and earth, a prominent settlement on a peninsula guarding the northern throat of Dublin Bay. It was a strategic prize, and the raid was not a random act of savagery. It was a targeted acquisition of resources. In the 9th century, one of the most valuable, self-replicating, and versatile resources was people. And the most prized of that resource were women. For the noble ladies of Et, life until that moment had been one of status, of purpose within their community. They were the weavers of kinship, the bearers of lineages, the keepers of culture. And then, in a single brutal act of violence, all of that was erased. Their names, their families, their history, stripped away. They were reclassified under a new and terrible vocabulary. The Norse word was thrall. It is a word we translate today as slave, but that translation is weak. It is insufficient. To be a thrall was to have your very personhood systematically dismantled. You were no longer a human being in the eyes of the law or society. You were property, a tool with a voice, a vessel that breathed, an object. Their journey into this new hell began on the water. Crammed together on the decks of a longship, they were now human cargo, their value directly tied to their health and their ability to survive the voyage. That journey itself was a merciless filter. The cold, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic claimed the weak, the sick, the heartbroken. Only the most resilient, or perhaps the most traumatized into a state of numb endurance, would have survived to see the destination. That destination was likely the burgeoning Viking port of Dyflin, the settlement that would one day become Dublin. But in that era, it was rapidly becoming something else, one of the largest and most ruthless slave markets in all of Western Europe. There, on the muddy shores, these women, who were once the mistresses of great halls, would be sorted, valued, and sold like livestock. Their physical attributes examined, their teeth checked, their bodies prodded and assessed for their capacity for labor and childbirth. The price for a life was chillingly specific. A healthy young woman, particularly one of high birth, could fetch between 12 and 20 ounces of pure silver. To put that in perspective, that was the equivalent of the entire annual output of a small, successful farmstead. A human life, a lineage, a future, traded for the price of a good harvest. And their journey might not end there. They were purchased by Norse settlers establishing new colonies in Ireland, or they were shipped further afield, becoming commodities in a vast, interconnected global economy of human trafficking. They could be sent to the markets of Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, or trafficked down the great river routes of the Rus, the Viking traders of the East. From there, they could be sold into the vast, insatiable slave economies of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, or the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Their skills, the very things that once defined their high status in Irish society, a knowledge of medicine, a talent for intricate weaving, the ability to read or compose poetry, were not erased. They were simply repurposed. They became features, selling points, bullet points on a list of attributes that might increase their price tag by a few more ounces of silver. The annals of Ulster don't mention a single name. They were deliberately made anonymous. They were a collective, a number in an entry, their individual lives, and stories erased and absorbed into the brutal economic engine of the Viking world. Confiscated, inventoried, silenced. Sometimes, through the cold fog of history, a name survives, a single thread pulled from the anonymous tapestry of suffering. The Icelandic Laxdela saga, written 2 centuries after the events it describes, long after the participants were dust, gives us one such name. It is a story preserved not in the cold ink of a monastic ledger, but in the firelight of an Icelandic hall, a memory passed down until it was finally written on calfskin. Her name was Melkorka, and she was a king's daughter. Her father was Merkjarten, a king in Ireland. Around the year 956, she lived in a world of relative security, of status, of a future that was mapped out for her from birth, a world of Gaelic poetry, of intricate Celtic metalwork, of the politics and alliances of her father's court. And then, in a storm of violence that likely lasted no more than a few hours, that world was utterly annihilated by a Viking raid. She was captured. The terror of that moment is unimaginable. The transition from princess to property was not a gradual decline, it was a fall from a cliff. She became one of the women from the first story. Her experience mirrored theirs. The brutal journey on the longship, the stripping away of her identity, the reclassification of her soul into the category of thrall. She was shipped to Norway and put up for sale in a bustling, chaotic market, a cacophony of foreign tongues and the smell of salt and tar and sweat. There, amidst the bartering for timber and furs and walrus ivory, she was displayed. She was seen by a man named Hoskuld Dala Kolsson. Hoskuld was not some simple raider. He was a wealthy and powerful Icelandic chieftain, a man of standing, on a trading voyage authorized by the King of Norway himself. He was a businessman, and he saw in this captive Irish girl a luxury item. The saga tells us he was struck by her beauty and her bearing. That is a crucial detail. Even in the depths of her degradation, stripped of her fine clothes and her dignity, something of her royalty, her innate authority, still clung to her. It was a ghost in her posture, in the defiance of her eyes. Hoskuld, a man accustomed to assessing value, recognized it instantly. He asked the merchant her name. The merchant, a rust trader named Gilly, a man who dealt in the long-distance trafficking of human beings, claimed not to know it. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. Names were irrelevant. Lineage was a liability. She was a product. Hoskuld paid 3 marks of silver for her. This was not a standard price. It was an enormous sum, a statement of his own wealth and power. A single mark of silver was 8 ounces, meaning he paid 24 ounces of pure silver for this one unnamed woman. It was 3 times the price of a prime milk cow, a cornerstone of the Icelandic agricultural economy. He wasn't just buying a slave, he was buying a masterpiece. And he bought her silence as well. For the entire journey back to the alien landscape of Iceland, a world of volcanic rock and ice, and for years after she arrived at his hall, Melkorka refused to speak, not a single word. She lived in his household as a concubine, a frilla, a status that placed her above a common field thrall but leagues below a wife. She was there for his pleasure, a beautiful silent fixture in his home. She bore him a son, a boy they named Olaf, and everyone, including Hoskuld, the man who owned her, believed she was a mute. They thought the trauma of her capture had shattered her voice. They were wrong. Her silence wasn't a symptom of her brokenness. It was her armor. It was the last desperate strategy of a powerless woman to retain some tiny, inviolable fragment of her inner self. In a world where her body, her time, and her future were owned by another, her voice was the one thing she could withhold. It was the only possession she had left. Her silence was a rebellion. The truth, when it came, was an accident, an overheard whisper that shattered the years of silence. One day, Hoskuld was walking near a stream on his farmstead, the wind carrying the sounds of his land. And he heard a voice. A woman's voice, speaking softly but clearly. He followed the sound and saw Melkorka speaking to their young son, Olaf. But she wasn't speaking Norse. She was speaking her native tongue, the language of her stolen home. She was teaching him Gaelic. The saga, in its haunting detail, even records the words she spoke, a truth she had kept locked inside herself for years. She was telling her son that his grandfather was not a nameless man, but Merkjarten, a king of the Irish. Imagine Hoskuld's shock. This mute thrall, this beautiful object he had purchased, had a history, a royal history. He confronted her, and the full story, the entire architecture of her stolen life, was revealed. Her status in the household improved, but only slightly. The fundamental equation of her existence did not change. She was never freed. She was never given the status of a wife. She remained in Iceland, a captive princess, whose true identity was discovered purely by chance. The son she secretly taught, Olaf, would grow up to be a powerful chieftain in his own right, known as Olaf the Peacock for his splendid taste in clothes. He eventually sailed to Ireland, a wealthy man, met his grandfather King Merkjarten, and was formally acknowledged as a member of Irish royalty. He was able to bridge the gap, to reclaim his heritage. But Melkorka never saw her home again. She died in Iceland, thousands of miles and a lifetime away from the kingdom she was born to inherit. Bought, hidden. revealed. The year is 870. The place, a windswept cliff overlooking the cold, grey expanse of the North Sea on the coast of Northumbria, a kingdom we would now recognize as parts of northern England and southeastern Scotland. This is the monastery at Coldingham. For 5 years, the force known to history as the Great Heathen Army had been tearing a bloody path across England, a plague of violence and terror. Now, this army, commanded by the infamous sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, men with names like Ivar, the Boneless, and Halfdan, turned its attention north. Their target was Coldingham, a double monastery, home to both monks and nuns. It was a place of prayer, of learning, of sanctuary. But to the advancing Vikings, it was simply a treasure chest waiting to be broken open. It held silver, gold, food, and women. The Abbess of Coldingham, a woman known to us from later chronicles as Ebba the Younger, was not naive. She knew exactly what was coming. She was a woman of learning, of administration. She knew the stories that traveled on the wind, the accounts of what happened when Viking raiders breached the walls of a religious house. The plunder of relics and the murder of monks were a certainty. But for the women, for the nuns who had dedicated their lives to God, there was another, more intimate terror. It was the systematic, strategic rape of the women inside. To our modern secular sensibilities, this is an act of horrific violence. But for Ebba and her nuns, steeped in a deeply religious worldview, it was something more. It was a fate worse than death. It was a violation that, in their belief system, tainted the soul itself, a spiritual defilement that would shadow them into the afterlife. It was a weapon of terror designed to break not just their bodies, but their faith. As the horns of the Viking army echoed up the cliffs, a sound promising imminent doom, Ebba gathered her entire community in the chapter house, the heart of the monastery. The account of what happened next, recorded by the 13th century chronicler Matthew Paris in his Florus Historiarum, is unflinching. It is a story of defiance so extreme it borders on the sublime. Ebba did not offer prayers for deliverance. She did not plead for mercy. She took direct, brutal action. Standing before her terrified sisters, she took a razor, and in a single, deliberate act of self-mutilation, she sliced off her own nose and her upper lip, rendering her face a bloody, unrecognizable mask of horror. She then turned to the other nuns, her face a testament to her resolve, and commanded them to do the same. Her words, as recorded by Paris, were, "Make yourselves a spectacle of horror to the lust of the barbarians." Imagine that moment. The terror in that room, the smell of blood and fear, and the incredible, terrifying courage it would take to follow that command. One by one, the nuns obeyed. They chose to destroy their own faces, to turn themselves into objects of revulsion rather than objects of desire. It was a desperate, gruesome strategy. They were taking control of the only thing they had left to control, their own bodies. When the Vikings finally smashed through the monastery's defenses, their bloodlust high, and burst into the chapter house, they were not met with trembling, pleading victims. They were met with a silent, standing assembly of intentionally disfigured women, their faces ruined, their eyes staring back in silent defiance. The psychological shock must have been immense. The invaders were cheated of their prize. Their expectations of a different kind of plunder were violently subverted, and their reaction was not pity, but pure, unadulterated rage. Enraged by this ultimate act of defiance, they showed no mercy. They barred the doors of the chapter house from the outside, trapping the women within the stone walls. They piled timber, furniture, anything that would burn against the building and set it ablaze. The abbess and her entire community were burned alive. Their final choice was not between life and death. It was between two different kinds of death. One at the hands of their violators, a death of the body, and in their view, the soul, and another in the purifying embrace of fire, a death where their physical integrity, however horribly scarred, remained their own. They chose the fire. Their bones, mixed with the ash and charcoal of their home, of their sacred space, became one with the cliffside soil. Their story is a chilling testament to the extremes of human resistance. It is a story where the only available weapon was the self, and the only path to victory was through total self-destruction. Their final act was not one of submission, but a terrible, triumphant reclamation of their own fate, burned, buried, unbroken. We move forward in time to the early 11th century, to the year 1011, the heart of Kent, England. The situation is dire. For nearly 3 years, a large and disciplined Danish army, under the command of the shrewd Viking chieftain Thorkel the Tall, had been systematically ravaging southern England. The policy of the English king, Ethelred the Unready, had been one of appeasement. He had tried to buy peace, paying ever larger sums of a tribute known as the Danegeld. But this policy had backfired spectacularly. The payments were seen not as a deterrent, but as an incentive. It was proof that England was rich and its leadership was weak. The Danegeld was like blood in the water, and it only encouraged more attacks, more demands. In September of 1011, Thorkel's forces laid siege to the city of Canterbury. This was not just another town. Canterbury was the ecclesiastical capital of England, the seat of the archbishop, the spiritual heart of the kingdom. Its fall would be a catastrophic blow to English morale. For 20 long days, the city held out. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our most vital sources for this period, tells us the defense was fierce. The citizens fought with the desperation of people defending their homes, their families, their entire world. But the city was not to be taken by force of arms alone. It was to be undone by betrayal. The Chronicle names the man Elfmer, an archdeacon whose life had previously been saved by the very man he would now betray, Archbishop Elfhea. For reasons lost to history, perhaps a grudge, perhaps a bribe, perhaps a simple, craven desire to save his own skin, Elfmer helped the Vikings find a way through the city's defenses. The Vikings poured through the gates, and the organized defense collapsed into a chaotic citywide massacre. The Chronicle paints a grim and vivid picture. It tells us they took the Archbishop Elfhea, and Elfwerd the king's reeve, and Leofrin, abbess of St. Mildred's, and Godwin, bishop of Rochester. They captured the entire leadership of the city, both secular and religious. They then systematically sacked the great cathedral, Christ Church, desecrating the holy site, and put most of the city's population, men, women, and children, to the sword. But the noble women, figures like Abbess Leofrin and other high-status ladies of the court, were not killed. They were far too valuable. Their fate was not to be a swift death in the chaos, but a slow, terrifying ordeal. They became hostages, bargaining chips in a brutal high-stakes negotiation between the Viking army and the shattered English kingdom. The army held them, and the other leaders, captive for months. Archbishop Elfhea became a symbol of resistance. The Vikings demanded a massive ransom for his freedom, but he refused to allow it to be paid. He famously declared that he would not have his freedom bought with money that belonged to the church, money that should be used to feed the poor. His defiance was heroic, but it sealed his fate. In April of 1012, at a drunken feast in Greenwich, the frustrated Viking captors began to pelt him with the bones from their meal. Finally, one of them, perhaps in a fit of rage or a moment of drunken pity, finished him with an axe blow to the back of the head. He was martyred, his story destined to be told in churches across England for centuries. The fate of the women was quieter, less dramatic, but no less terrifying. Their lives were line items in a national budget of despair. The following year, an almost unimaginable sum of 48,000 pounds of silver was paid to Thorkel E.S. army to finally make them leave. This was a staggering national ransom, a payment that would have crippled the English economy for years, and the freedom of these high-status women, Abbess Leofrin and the others, was almost certainly a part of that transaction. Their lives were calculated as a specific value in a grand political and economic negotiation. They were pawns in the highest stakes game of their time, their survival dependent not on courage or faith, but on the cold weight of silver and the shifting whims of their captors. They endured months of captivity, of uncertainty, of living daily with the men who had murdered their friends and destroyed their city. They survived, but at a cost we can barely comprehend. They were returned, but their stories, the details of their ordeal, were subsumed into the larger political narrative. Their individual trauma was erased, lost in the accounting of a king's ransom, captured, ransomed, erased. We return to the same fateful year, 870. While Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan's army was burning monasteries in the east of Britain, another formidable Viking force was executing a meticulously planned attack on the west. The leaders were Olaf the White, the ambitious Norse king of Dublin, and his ally, the very same Ivar, who was simultaneously campaigning on the other side of the island. Their target was one of the most formidable natural fortresses in all of Britain, Alt Clut, the Rock of the Clyde, known today as Dumbarton Rock. This near-impregnable volcanic plug, rising sheer from the banks of the River Clyde, was the capital of the ancient and proud kingdom of Strathclyde. For the Britons of this kingdom, it was their heart, their stronghold, a symbol of their enduring sovereignty. Taking it would mean breaking the back of their nation. For 4 agonizing months, the fortress held out against a brutal and relentless siege. The attackers could not scale the sheer rock faces. The defenses were too strong, so they changed tactics. They couldn't go over, so they would wait them out. They surrounded the rock, creating an iron ring of warriors, cutting off all supplies, all reinforcements. Most critically, they cut off its water supply. The Annals of Ulster, that same cold, factual record from Ireland, documents the outcome with chilling precision. It states that after 120 days, the well inside the fortress ran dry. The defenders, who had withstood months of attacks, were now defeated by a more fundamental enemy, thirst. Dying in agony, with no hope of relief, they finally surrendered. What followed was not a simple sacking. It was one of the single largest, most organized slave-raiding events of the entire Viking Age in Britain. Olaf and Ivar didn't just take what they could carry and leave. They were systematic. They spent the entire winter on the Clyde, gathering their plunder, organizing their captives, and consolidating their gains. In the spring of 871, a fleet of 200 longships sailed from the Clyde back to their base in Dublin. The annals state they brought back a great booty in people, Angles, Britons, and Picts. The ship's holds were packed not just with treasure, but with human beings. Among the captives was the king of Strathclyde himself, a man named Artgall, and with him, his wife, his daughters, his entire court, and the noble women who had managed the affairs of the kingdom. In the space of a day, their status had evaporated. The Queen of Strathclyde was now a slave, her value assessed in the same cold calculus as a farm animal. King Artgall himself was later killed in Dublin, at Olaf's instigation, to remove any potential rallying point for his defeated people. For the women, their rank now meant nothing. In fact, it might have made them more valuable, more exotic prizes on the open market. They were now part of this massive human cargo, herded onto the ships, their fate completely uncertain. They were destined for the slave market in Dublin, the same great hub of human trafficking that had received the women of Et 50 years earlier. Their story demonstrates with terrifying clarity the scale, the organization, and the core purpose of much of Viking warfare. This was not raiding as a byproduct of war. The enslavement of people was the primary objective. It was a business model. This was state-level industrialized human trafficking, orchestrated by kings for the express purpose of economic gain. The siege was the investment, the thirst was the weapon, the ships were the transport, and the women were the profit. Sieged, thirsted, shipped. Now we turn our attention from the shores of the conquered to the shores of the conquerors, to the newly settled land of Iceland in the late 9th century. The story of Iceland's colonization is often framed as a heroic saga, a tale of brave Norse explorers and rugged individualists seeking freedom from the tyranny of kings in Norway. The primary source for this period, the Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, meticulously details the genealogies of the first settlers, the parcels of land they claimed, and the families they established. It is, on the surface, a foundational document, a national epic of creation. But if you read it carefully, between the lines of proud genealogies, a much darker and more violent story emerges. This new society, this bold experiment in freedom, was built on a foundation of stolen women. The book contains cold, matter-of-fact evidence of how this new nation was populated. Let's take the saga of one Ingemund the Old, a powerful and respected chieftain from Norway. The account of his settlement is typical, but before he and his followers settled their new lands in Iceland, the record notes that his men, including his foster brothers, launched raids on Ireland. The Landnámabók states it plainly, without embellishment or apology, that they returned with captives. It was a simple statement of fact, a routine part of the process. One of these captives was an Irish noblewoman named Refgerd. She was taken by a Viking named Eyvindur Surkvir and forced to be his wife in the new, harsh, and utterly alien landscape of Iceland. Her story is not presented as a tragedy. It is presented as a transaction, a necessary step in the founding of a new family line, a new farmstead. Her trauma, her loss, her terror, none of it is recorded. She is simply an imported womb, a piece of foundational property. Another chieftain, Kettle the Foolish, is recorded as having settled in a place called Kirkjubeir. The book notes that because he was a Christian, no heathens would live there. It presents him as an outlier, a man of faith. But when you examine the genealogies of his descendants, you find they married into prominent Icelandic families whose matriarchs were explicitly named as captured Irish women. The Christian settlement was interwoven with, and dependent upon, the families built by men who had violently stolen their wives. These are not isolated incidents. They are a pattern. And this is not just the stuff of literary sagas. It is a story now being told by our very DNA. Modern genetic studies of the Icelandic population have provided a stunning biological confirmation of these tales. The evidence is written in the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, and the Y chromosome passed down through the paternal line. The results are stark. While the vast majority of the original male settlers of Iceland have Norse paternal ancestry, tracing back to Norway, and Scandinavia, up to 63% of the original female settlers had maternal ancestry from Ireland and Scotland. Let that number sink in. The math is brutal and undeniable. For nearly every Norse chieftain who established a farmstead, for every proud patriarch listed in the Landnámabók, there was often a woman who had been violently taken from her homeland, forced onto a ship, and compelled to become an unwilling wife and mother at the edge of the known world. They were the true foundation of this new nation, a foundation laid not in heroic exploration, but in systematic violence and abduction. They built a nation with their bodies, with their labor, and with their silent, unrecorded grief. Their sons and daughters would grow up to call themselves Icelandic, to speak a Norse tongue, to tell sagas of their father's great deeds. But the ghost of a different language, a different culture, a different home was carried in their blood. a silent testament to the mothers who had been plundered, transported, and replanted in a foreign soil. Finally, we come to a grave, the most spectacular Viking artifact ever found. In 1904, archaeologists began excavating a large burial mound near the Oslo Fjord in Norway at a place called Oseberg. What they uncovered, preserved almost perfectly in the oxygen-free blue clay, was a breathtaking sight, the Oseberg ship, a 21-meter-long oak vessel, its prow carved into the shape of a magnificent coiling serpent. The ship itself was a work of art, a testament to incredible wealth and power. Inside was a burial chamber dated by tree ring chronology to the summer of the year 834. It was filled with treasures, a richly decorated wooden cart, 3 ceremonial sledges, ornate beds, chests, exquisite tapestries, and the ritualistically sacrificed remains of 15 horses and 4 dogs. This was a funeral of staggering importance. In the burial chamber lay the skeletons of 2 women. One was elderly, between 70 and 80 years old. Her bones showed the ravages of advanced cancer. She was clearly a woman of immense power, a queen, a priestess, a matriarch of the highest order. For decades, it was assumed the second woman, who was younger around 50, was her high-ranking servant or companion, someone who had chosen to follow her beloved mistress into the afterlife in an act of ultimate loyalty. But modern science tells a potentially much darker story. Analysis of the younger woman's mitochondrial DNA, that same maternal genetic marker, revealed a haplogroup, U7, which is extremely rare in Scandinavia. Its origins, its highest concentrations, are found in the regions around the Black Sea and Iran. This physical evidence, written in her very cells, strongly suggests she was a foreigner, brought to Norway from a vast distance away. Her story was further illuminated by analyzing the chemical isotopes in her bones. These isotopes lock in the signature of the geology of the place where a person grew up, reflecting the food and water they consumed. Her results showed a sudden, dramatic shift late in life to a high-protein, marine-based diet typical of the Norwegian elite. This indicates she had not always lived there. The likely scenario is chilling. She may have been a noblewoman from the east, perhaps from a Persian or Black Sea kingdom, captured in a raid by the Russ and trafficked north. She was then forced into servitude in the household of the powerful Oseberg queen. Her life in Norway was likely one of privilege compared to a field thrall, but she was property nonetheless. And when her mistress died, her life was forfeit. She was sacrificed, perhaps willingly as part of a complex ritual, or perhaps not, to serve in death, as she had been forced to serve in life. The lavish burial, the magnificent ship, the incredible treasures, they were not for her. They were a reflection of her owner's status. Her presence in that magnificent tomb is not a story of loyalty. It is the story of the ultimate act of possession. A life taken from a distant land, and then taken again to adorn the grave of her owner. Bound, buried, forgotten.